Have you ever introduced yourself, even just in your own head, with the thing that happened to you? Not your name, not what you do, the event, the diagnosis, the history, as if it were the first true fact about you, the thing that explains everything else that follows. Have you ever caught yourself thinking, almost automatically, "That's just how I am because of what happened," and felt a strange mixture of relief and dread at the same time? Relief because it explains so much, dread because it sounds permanent, like a sentence rather than a description. Have you ever watched yourself respond to an ordinary situation with a reaction that felt much bigger than the moment deserved, and known, somewhere underneath the reaction, exactly where it came from, and felt powerless to stop it anyway, even with the knowledge fully available to you? If any of this sounds familiar, I want to talk to you directly about something that I think gets confused constantly, in therapy language, in self-help content, in the way we talk about difficult pasts. The confusion is this: believing that what happened to you and who you are have become the same thing. They haven't. They can't, actually. But understanding why requires looking honestly at what trauma actually does and what it doesn't do. And the difference matters more than almost anything else in how you build a life after difficult things have happened to you. Let me start with something that needs to be said clearly, because it's easy to misread what's coming next as minimizing. What happened to you was real. The impact was real. I'm not here to tell you that trauma is just a story you're telling yourself, or that if you simply changed your perspective, the difficulty would dissolve. Trauma changes the brain. It changes the nervous system. It changes how threat gets perceived, how trust gets calibrated, how safety gets experienced in your own body. These aren't metaphors. They're documented, physical changes that occur in response to overwhelming experience, and they don't simply disappear because you've decided to think about them differently. So when I say you are not your trauma, I'm not saying trauma didn't really affect you, or that its effects aren't real and significant. I'm saying something more specific. Trauma is something that happened to you and changed you. It is not itself the entirety of who you are. There's a difference between "this happened and shaped me" and "this is what I am." And that difference, however subtle it sounds, changes everything about how you relate to your own life going forward. I want to use an image that might make this clearer. Imagine a tree that grew up in difficult conditions, poor soil, insufficient light, maybe a storm that bent it permanently in one direction during its early growth. The tree is genuinely shaped by these conditions. It grew the way it grew because of what it encountered. If you looked at this tree's particular lean, its particular pattern of growth, you could trace it back to specific events in its history. The shape isn't random. It's a direct response to what actually happened. But the tree is not the storm. The tree is not the poor soil. The tree is a living thing that was shaped by those conditions and continues growing every single day in response to whatever conditions it currently encounters, not only the conditions of its past. This is closer to what's actually true about trauma and identity than the more common metaphor of trauma as something broken that needs fixing, or trauma as a wound that defines the entire shape of a life. You were shaped by what happened. The shape is real and visible if you look closely, but you are still growing, still responding to current conditions, still more than simply a record of the storm that bent you at some point in the past. I want to talk about why this distinction matters so much practically, not just philosophically. If trauma is who you are, if it's the core identity rather than a shaping influence, then change feels almost impossible, because changing who you fundamentally are feels like a kind of self-erasure, a betrayal of the truth of your experience. This is part of why people sometimes resist healing in ways that look, from the outside, like resistance to getting better. It's not actually resistance to feeling better. It's resistance to losing an identity that has, for better or worse, organized an entire sense of self for years. If your trauma has become the central organizing fact of your identity, the lens through which you understand your reactions, your relationships, your limitations, your story, then the prospect of healing can feel less like relief and more like loss. Who would you even be if this defining feature were no longer the central thing explaining you? But if trauma is something that happened to you and shaped you, significant, real, but not the entirety of your identity, then healing doesn't require losing yourself. It requires growing in a direction that includes the shaping without being permanently confined by it. The tree with the storm-bent trunk can still grow upward, can still produce new branches that reach in directions the original storm never touched, even while the bent trunk remains visible, part of the tree's actual history. This distinction changes how an entire recovery process can feel. If it's reaching you, subscribe. I want to talk about what trauma actually does to shape a person, because understanding the mechanism helps clarify why it feels so central to identity even when it isn't actually the whole of it. Trauma, especially trauma that happened repeatedly or during formative years, tends to install a set of expectations about the world, expectations about whether people can be trusted, whether your needs will be met, whether the world is generally safe or generally dangerous, whether you have any real influence over what happens to you, or whether you're simply at the mercy of forces outside your control. These expectations get embedded below conscious thought. They don't operate as beliefs you can simply examine and dismiss through reasoning. They operate as the background assumptions your nervous system uses to interpret every new situation, often faster than conscious thought can intervene. This is why trauma can feel like identity rather than influence. It's not sitting in your conscious mind as a memory you can examine from a comfortable distance. It's operating as the lens through which you perceive everything else, which makes it feel less like something you have and more like something you simply are. But a lens, however thoroughly it shapes perception, is still something separate from the eye looking through it. The eye, the actual perceiving self, exists independently of the lens, even though the lens significantly affects what that self experiences and how it interprets what it experiences. I want to talk about something specific that happens when people start to actually do healing work, because the early stages often feel disorienting in a way that's worth naming directly. As you start to separate what happened to me from who I fundamentally am, there's often a period of genuine confusion. If the trauma response isn't actually identity, then who are you underneath it? If the hypervigilance, the people-pleasing, the difficulty trusting, the specific pattern of reactions you've had for years, if none of this is fundamentally who you are, then what is? This question can feel destabilizing precisely because the trauma response has been doing real work for a long time, organizing your behavior, explaining your reactions, giving you a coherent story about why you are the way you are. Removing that organizing structure, even partially, even temporarily, can create a kind of identity vacuum before something more genuinely yours has the chance to take its place. This is a normal and necessary part of the process, even though it's uncomfortable. The confusion isn't evidence that something is going wrong. It's evidence that the old structure, trauma as identity, is loosening its grip, and something more accurate, more spacious, more genuinely yours hasn't yet had time to fully take its place. This period requires patience that's hard to access when you're in the middle of it, because not having a clear, organized story about who you are can feel worse, in the short term, than having a clear story that happens to be too small and too defined by difficult events. But the discomfort of not yet knowing is different from, and ultimately more workable than, the discomfort of being permanently confined by a story that was never the whole truth in the first place. I want to talk about the specific phrase trauma response because I think it's used in a way that sometimes does more harm than good, even though it was developed to help. There's a tendency, once someone learns about trauma responses, to label every difficult reaction as one. Got irritated at a small inconvenience? trauma response. Felt distant in a conversation, trauma response. Didn't want to go to a social event, trauma response. This labeling, while sometimes accurate, can also become its own kind of trap. It can suggest that every difficult feeling or reaction must be traced back to the original wound, reinforcing the very idea this entire conversation is trying to dismantle. That trauma is the explanation for everything, the central organizing fact that accounts for every subsequent experience. Sometimes irritation is just irritation. Sometimes distance in a conversation is about being tired, or disagreeing with what's being said, or simply not having much in common with the person you're talking to, not necessarily a reenactment of an old wound. Sometimes not wanting to go to a social event is a legitimate preference, not evidence of unhealed avoidance. Part of moving beyond trauma as identity is allowing yourself to have ordinary, unremarkable reactions that don't require deep excavation back to the original wound every single time. Not every difficult feeling is a symptom. Sometimes a difficult feeling is just a difficult feeling, the kind any person with any history would have in that particular situation. This matters because constantly tracing every reaction back to the trauma can paradoxically reinforce the very identity confusion this conversation is trying to address, keeping the trauma at the center of every explanation, even in the act of trying to heal from it. I want to talk about what it actually looks like to carry difficult history well, because the goal isn't to pretend it didn't happen or to minimize its ongoing relevance. Carrying trauma well doesn't mean it stops mattering. It doesn't mean the impact disappears, or that you reach some final state where the past no longer affects you at all. That's not a realistic standard, and holding yourself to it tends to produce more suffering, not less. Carrying it well looks more like this. The history is acknowledged, genuinely integrated into your understanding of yourself, available for you to reference when it's actually relevant. But it's not the first thing you reach for to explain every subsequent experience. It has a place in your story without occupying the entire story. This is similar to how a person can carry a significant physical injury from years ago. The injury is real. It might still ache sometimes, might still limit certain movements, might require ongoing attention and care. But a person who has genuinely integrated this into their life doesn't experience the injury as their entire identity. They experience it as one real significant fact among many real significant facts about their life, body, and history. This is different from either extreme, pretending the injury never happened and pushing through as if it has no ongoing impact, or organizing your entire identity and every decision around the injury as the central explanatory fact of your existence. The middle path, where the history is acknowledged and accommodated without becoming the entirety of the self, is harder to find and maintain than either extreme, but it's also the most accurate reflection of what's actually true. I want to talk about something specific that happens in relationships when trauma has become central to someone's identity, because this dynamic deserves direct attention. If your trauma has become the primary lens through which you understand yourself, it often becomes, by extension, the primary lens through which you expect others to understand you too. You might find yourself needing partners, friends, or family to constantly accommodate, reference, and validate the trauma-centered story in order to feel truly seen or understood. This isn't a character flaw. It makes sense given how central the story has become. But it can create a specific strain in relationships because the other person is being asked to engage primarily with your history rather than with the fuller, more complex, more currently alive person you actually are day to day, beyond the organizing narrative of what happened to you. As the trauma becomes less central, as it moves from being the entirety of the story to being one true and significant part of a larger, more complete story, relationships often shift in a way that can feel both liberating and slightly disorienting. People start relating to more of you, not because they were ever incapable of it, but because there's now more of you available to be related to beyond the central organizing narrative that used to take up most of the space. This is one of the clearer, practical benefits of moving beyond trauma as identity. It's not just an internal private shift. It changes the actual texture of how you're known and engaged with by the people closest to you, opening space for a kind of intimacy that the trauma-centered identity, however understandable its origins, tended to crowd out. Have you ever noticed yourself feeling almost defensive when someone suggests you might be more than your difficult history? This reaction makes sense and deserves examination because it points to something real about why trauma as identity develops in the first place, and why it can be so hard to release even when you intellectually understand the distinction this conversation is describing. For a lot of people, identifying with their trauma developed as a way of making sense of an otherwise senseless experience. If something terrible happened to you and there was no clear reason, no explanation, no sense to be made of it, turning it into your defining identity can provide a kind of narrative coherence that the original experience never offered. At least now, there's a story. At least now, things make sense, even if the sense they make is painful. There's also often a protective function. If you fully identify with your trauma response, you're never caught off guard by it. The hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting, the specific patterns that developed. If these are simply who you are rather than a response that might change, there's a kind of strange safety in that fixedness. Nothing more can be lost because the worst has already happened and has already become permanently incorporated into your sense of self. Loosening the grip of this identity, then, isn't simply an intellectual exercise. It requires giving up a kind of protection, however limited and costly that protection actually is. This is worth naming honestly because if you find yourself resisting the ideas in this conversation, the resistance probably isn't about disagreeing with the logic. It's about not yet feeling safe enough to imagine an identity that's more fluid, more responsive to current conditions, less permanently fixed by what happened in the past. Have you ever wondered why some people who experience similarly difficult events end up with very different relationships to those events over time? This isn't about some people being naturally stronger or more resilient, which is a comparison that tends to produce shame rather than insight. It's usually about the conditions that surrounded the original event and what happened afterward, particularly around whether the person had support, validation, and a chance to actually process what happened rather than simply survive it and move forward without ever returning to it. Trauma that occurs in isolation, without anyone acknowledging what happened, without support in processing it, without the chance to make sense of it in the company of people who could help hold the weight of it, tends to become more central to identity over time, precisely because there was no other container for it. The identity itself becomes the container, in the absence of any other place for the experience to be held. Trauma that occurs with support, even difficult, painful, genuinely traumatic experiences, tends to integrate somewhat differently when there's been a chance to process it with others, to have it acknowledged, to not carry the entire weight of making sense of it alone. This doesn't mean support eliminates impact. It means support changes how the impact gets carried, often making it more possible for the experience to become one significant part of a larger story rather than the entire defining structure of identity. If you're someone whose trauma became deeply central to your identity, it's worth asking honestly whether you had genuine support in processing it at the time, or whether you were largely left to make sense of it alone. This isn't about blame toward yourself or toward anyone else. It's about understanding why the identity formed the way it did, which can make it easier to approach the work of loosening it with compassion rather than frustration at yourself for not having already done so. Have you ever felt a strange kind of guilt about wanting to be more than your trauma, as if moving beyond it would somehow be dishonoring what happened or letting whoever caused it off the hook? This is a more common feeling than people tend to admit, and it deserves to be named directly because it can be one of the more powerful unconscious forces keeping someone locked into a trauma-centered identity long after they've intellectually understood the case for moving beyond it. There's sometimes an unconscious belief that staying visibly affected by what happened is a form of testimony, proof that the harm was real, that it mattered, that the person or circumstances responsible should be held accountable for the damage caused. If you start to feel more whole, more spacious, less defined by what happened, there can be a fear that this somehow erases the reality of the harm, or implies that it wasn't actually that significant after all. This is worth examining directly because it confuses two separate things: the reality and seriousness of what happened, and the ongoing structure of your own identity in response to it. The harm was real regardless of how you carry it now. Whether you remain permanently organized around it or move toward a fuller, more integrated relationship with it doesn't change the truth of what occurred. It only changes how much of your present and future remains hostage to your past. Healing doesn't testify against the reality of harm. If anything, a person who has done the work of integrating their history while continuing to grow is offering a different kind of testimony. Proof that what happened was survivable, that meaning and connection remain possible afterward, that the harm, however real and significant, didn't have the final word over the entirety of a life. Have you ever noticed that the version of yourself you present to people who don't know your history feels different from the version you present to people who do? This is worth paying attention to because it often reveals something important about how thoroughly the trauma identity has taken over versus how much of your life is actually being lived from somewhere outside of it. If you find that you're a genuinely different person, lighter, less defined by vigilance or caution, more spontaneously yourself, in contexts where your history isn't known or referenced, this is meaningful information. It suggests that the trauma-centered identity isn't actually the totality of who you are. It's a structure that activates specifically in contexts where it's been invited to take center stage, whether by your own habitual thought patterns or by other people's expectations and references to your history. This doesn't mean you should hide your history from everyone, or that the goal is to simply avoid context where it comes up. That would just be another form of management rather than genuine integration. But noticing the contrast, noticing that there's a version of you who exists more freely when the trauma narrative isn't actively being centered, is useful evidence. It tells you that the fuller, less defined by the past self isn't a hypothetical possibility you're trying to manufacture from nothing. It already exists. It's already real. It's already something you have direct lived experience of being, at least in certain contexts. The work then isn't creating something from scratch. It's expanding the contexts in which that fuller self gets to show up, rather than confining it only to situations where your history happens not to be relevant or known. Have you ever found yourself almost performing your trauma for other people, explaining it in a particular way, with particular emphasis, almost as if rehearsing a story you've told many times before? This is extremely common and worth examining without shame, because it usually develops for understandable reasons rather than out of any kind of manipulation or dishonesty. When something difficult happens, especially something that other people respond to with concern, sympathy, or particular attentiveness, there can be an unconscious reinforcement of the narrative itself. The story gets told, people respond with care and validation, and that care and validation, while genuinely deserved and appropriate, can also create an unconscious incentive to keep telling the story in a way that continues to produce the same caring response. This isn't cynical manipulation. It's a basic feature of how humans learn, attaching meaning and behavior to whatever produces connection and care, especially if connection and care have felt scarce or difficult to access in other ways. If telling the trauma story reliably produces attention, sympathy, and a particular kind of closeness with others, some part of the system learns that the story is valuable in a very literal, almost transactional sense, separate from its accuracy or its relevance to the present moment. Noticing this pattern in yourself, if it's present, isn't an indictment. It's useful information about another way the trauma identity can become entrenched, not just through the original difficulty, but through the secondary, ongoing reinforcement of repeatedly telling and retelling the story in ways that produce real, valuable connection, even while also keeping the story centrally located in your sense of self longer than might otherwise be necessary. The alternative isn't to stop telling your story when it's genuinely relevant or helpful to share. It's to notice when the telling has become more habitual than intentional, and to ask honestly whether this particular telling, in this particular context, is actually serving connection and understanding, or whether it's primarily reinforcing an identity structure that you're otherwise trying to expand beyond. I want to close with something about growth, because I don't want this conversation to end only with the dismantling of an old story without pointing toward what actually becomes possible. The thing about a tree shaped by a storm is that it keeps growing. Not despite the storm, exactly, and not because of it either. It simply keeps growing, incorporating the shape the storm gave it into a structure that continues developing in response to whatever conditions it currently encounters. Sunlight, soil, seasons that have nothing to do with the original storm at all. This is available to you too. Not a return to who you were before whatever happened to you happened. That person, in a literal sense, doesn't exist anymore. The same way the tree before the storm doesn't exist anymore either. But a continued, ongoing growth that includes the shaping without being permanently confined to only ever responding to that one event, that one history, that one defining piece of your story. You are allowed to be someone who experienced something difficult and also someone who is becoming something more day by day in response to the actual current conditions of your life, not only in permanent reaction to what happened years or decades ago. That growth doesn't erase the history, it includes it, the way the tree includes the storm in its actual shape while still reaching every single day toward whatever light is currently available. Have you ever wondered what it would actually feel like in your body to have a difficult memory present without it taking over completely? This is worth imagining concretely, because most people, when they think about trauma resolving, imagine something binary. Either the memory still produces a full activation, the same intensity it's always produced, or it's somehow gone entirely, no longer affecting them at all. The actual experience of moving toward integration tends to be different from either of those extremes. The memory remains. It can still produce a response, a tightening, a flicker of old feeling, a moment of recognition that something in the present has activated something from the past. But the response is sized appropriately to the present moment, rather than carrying the full original intensity every single time it's touched. This is sometimes described as the difference between a memory that's hot and a memory that's cooled. A hot memory produces the same overwhelming response every time it's accessed, as if the original event were happening again in real time. A cooled memory can be accessed, even discussed in detail, while the person accessing it remains grounded in the present, aware that they're remembering something difficult rather than re-experiencing it as though it were currently occurring. Most healing work moves memories from hot to cooled, not from present to absent. This matters because it changes what you should actually be aiming for. You're not trying to erase what happened or stop it from ever affecting you. You're trying to change its temperature, its intensity, its capacity to completely override your present moment awareness so that it can exist as part of your history without periodically taking over your entire experience of the present. This is a more realistic, achievable goal than complete resolution. And it's also, I'd argue, a healthier one. A person with no response at all to a genuinely significant past harm would be concerning in its own way, suggesting either dissociation or a kind of disconnection from their own history that isn't actually desirable. The goal isn't numbness, it's appropriately sized response, available to you without controlling you. One more thing before the comments, because it matters. If you've recognized a lot of yourself in this conversation, the recognition itself might feel uncomfortable, even destabilizing. That's expected. You've potentially just loosened, even slightly, a structure that's been organizing a significant part of your identity for a long time, possibly for years or decades. Give yourself time with that. This isn't something that resolves by the end of a single video, or even by the end of a single conversation with yourself or with someone else. It's a gradual reorientation, built through repeated practice of noticing when the trauma narrative is taking over more space than the present moment actually requires, and gently, without force, making room for more of you to exist alongside it. You are allowed to take this slowly. You are allowed to still feel uncertain about who you are underneath the organizing story you've carried for so long. That uncertainty isn't failure. It's the necessary, uncomfortable space between an old identity that's loosening its grip and a fuller one that hasn't yet fully arrived. It will arrive, not all at once, but it will. For the comments, what's one part of your identity that you've realized is actually about what happened to you rather than about who you fundamentally are? Name it. That distinction is where the growth actually starts. I'll see you in the next one.